Learning Economics. I'm very excited to have with me today James Plunkett, who is the author of a book called End State, 9 Ways Society is Broken and How We Fix It. So, James, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you actually sent you sent me, I think, a message on Twitter originally, offering to send me a copy of this book, and yeah, so you sent it through to me, and I thought it was really good. It was, I don't know, it was quite refreshing, and I think you approach things with something of a, I'd say, like a problem solving mindset. You know, here are the problems in society, and here's how we can use better governance to fix them. So, I mean, if your book is an attempt to update governance for the modern world, one of the things you kind of start with is you say, you know, this isn't the first time that we've fallen behind in our systems and how we approach governance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was an interesting experience writing the book because I didn't set out to write an optimistic book. I started off thinking this would be a book about the kind of mess we're in a sense. And what happened in the course of writing it, I stumbled on actually a small collection of sort of essays and newspaper articles and letters from the time of the Industrial Revolution. And I really remember this moment. I was in a secondhand bookshop and I sat down and put my bag on the floor and opened this little book, and it gave me this really quite almost a kind of eerie sense of similarity with that period, in particularly sort of mid 19th century, from about sort of 1840 to 1870, 1880, when obviously the Industrial Revolution in Britain was causing these sweeping changes to the way people lived their lives, to the way the economy functioned, to the way that work functioned. And our systems of government, or kind of just the way in which we govern society, if you like, was completely failing to cope with this transition, with this new type of economy and new type of society that emerged. And I was very struck. It just the kind of mood or the vibe that came through in this writing from that period felt so similar to now. This kind of sense that we're sort of things are spinning out of control, that we've sort of lost our grip, that there's this mounting set of public policy challenges as we would think of them now. You know, today's challenges being things like monopolies, big tech monopolies, insecurity in digital forms of work, mental health and burnout, and that we don't really have the kind of systems or the tools or the, if you like, the kind of paradigms in place to respond to those problems. And that just felt actually really quite similar to that mid 19th century period when all these new problems were emerging at that time, problems like sewage running through the rivers, problems like child labor. And again, they didn't have the tools either. And eventually what made me optimistic was we did build new tools. We came upon new ways of governing, and we kind of got through that series of problems. And, you know, maybe we can do that again.
It's interesting that you say it wasn't supposed to be optimistic when you started, because it really could easily have been. I mean, was the motivation literally for writing your book like this, you know, the hit more, less, you know, maybe this title still, but without the how we fix it, right? Like just 9 ways society is broken. Is that kind of where you were at when you started writing?
Yeah, it was definitely a book about endings, because I had this kind of very strong sense, I still do actually, that we're coming to the end, the sort of natural end of the, how would you describe it? The governing settlement, I guess, that we put in place in the 20th century. It feels like it served us, you know, and we could argue about how well it served us, but I think I would argue it served us kind of well in the sense that it progressed us forwards on these significant social challenges around things like life expectancy, extending life expectancy, you know, governing industrial markets, to some extent governing an industrial economy. But it feels like it's coming to the end of its life in the sense that it's struggling to cope with 21st century challenges. And particularly in the book, I talk about the digital economy and the new set of challenges that brings. So it kind of started as a book about endings. And then I realized as I was writing it, it was also to some extent a book about beginnings and the sort of the emergence of the thing that will replace
Yeah.
governing settlement.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of sounding cheesy, it's, I guess, a kind of the night is always darkest before the dawn type thing, right? We've got all these massive pressing problems, and I mean, you listed a few, right? digital tech monopolies and the digital economy are quite a heavy focus in the book, I think. But there's also obviously climate change lurking in the background, and not to mention the pandemic and supply chain issues. And you can almost you can list quite a few major challenges that we face. But let's go back to digital monopolies, because this is, you mentioned it a couple of times already, and it did stand out as a very it stands out as a modern challenge, right? And it's very distinct to what we've seen before, and the ways that we need to approach either trust busting, regulating, thinking about how we treat our data, all of these types of things. I mean, we need completely new sets of ideas to approach these things, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this whole debate about competition in digital markets is I think, a really good example of how we think some of these things are the same old problem, but actually they're very distinct and very different. And I think it's increasingly clear, and I think economists increasingly actually kind of agree upon this, that the kinds of monopolies we're finding in digital markets are sort of different to some degree. So the monopolies of Google and Facebook, the biggest platforms, which are so arise from these structural aspects of the way digital markets function, and particularly, as you mentioned, data. These kind of self-amplifying effects, where if you're running a big platform like that, the more data you have, the better your platform, and therefore the more data you have, and therefore the better your platform. And so these often described as winner takes all effects in digital markets, where you get a single winner pulling far ahead on search, for example, or in social networks. And it's I think it's a different kind of challenge. People sometimes reach for these old policy solutions. People talk about breaking them up. And as I say in the book, I mean, do we really want Google broken up into multiple search engines? Do we really want our friends split over more sort of social networks? I'm not sure we do. So I think we need new approaches. I talk about opening up these platforms rather than breaking them up, for example, as a sort of a different way of thinking about the challenge. Gets you into debates about open data and interoperability, which are sort of really gaining steam, I think, in among regulators. So I think sometimes we use these old words like competition. We think it means the same thing. And actually, the meaning of the word almost has morphed, has changed before our eyes.
So how do we, if we don't break them up? I mean, I get what you're saying, right? It's like, you can imagine if you've got a really big, supermarket, you can imagine breaking that up into smaller retail shops, and it wouldn't be a monopoly anymore. Yet the service might be, roughly the same. You wouldn't be kind of fundamentally endangering the service. But obviously, with several Twitters, which were actually, I mean, Elon Musk is helpfully trialing what this looks like to break up into several different social media sites, right? I mean, it's not as good, because I don't know what people are saying on Threads or Mastodon, right? And so you lose all of these benefits. But if we're not breaking them up, then what do we do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. So I think it's worth just saying briefly that I think there are some cases where breakups feel relevant. So the most obvious one, I think, is Amazon, where
Right.
you have actually what is actually quite a classical challenge, similar to when the railways started buying coal companies and then stopping other coal companies moving coal on their tracks, right? And we broke those up. We said you can't own both the tracks and the thing you're moving on the tracks. And Amazon very clearly owns the tracks, if you like, the sort of platform, and also tries to sell stuff, or does sell stuff on its own platform. And so there is a case for the sort of breakups in those cases, I think. But I think in the case of big social networks, their power comes really from the fact that they've built these things as kind of private gardens. And so you can't move between them. So, you can't cross post from Twitter into Facebook. You can't move your friends with you. As someone who's tried to leave Twitter, and I came crawling back when I tried to leave a year or so ago, because of course there's a network effect at work there. And so when I tried to leave, and you go to Mastodon, none of the people I want to follow are there, and so you come crawling back. So I think there's debates about interoperability, I think, is a big part of it. So can you force these platforms to work to interoperable standards so that you can take your friends with you so that you can cross-post even from one platform into another, so that you can port your data between them, particularly important for workers. If you've accumulated a really strong feedback record on Uber, driving for Uber, can you take your feedback record to a different driving platform? At the moment, you can't, and so you're sort of stuck within these ecosystems. It also means things like opening up these ecosystems for developers. So, one thing Facebook and others do is they kind of control access to the ecosystem. And when someone builds an app, say that makes good use of these systems and becomes threatening, they shut down access and kill off that business almost overnight. And so, you need better ways to allow people open access to build tools and build interesting experiences within these ecosystems. And it's a big deal, that stuff. I mean, it's sort of reclassifying them as not just private companies, but as something different and more important than that, and treating them differently in the regulation.
So it seems to come down in that chapter. I forget which chapter it is, one or two. It comes down to ownership, right? As well. There's this like issue of like who owns the data that we generate when we're using these apps, and if we are deemed to own it ourselves, then issues like interoperability will become easier to manage, right?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it also comes down to I think these things are new things, right? Like, and it's easy to reach for old categories. So sometimes when I talk about this stuff, people say, well, surely you're not saying let's nationalize Facebook. The only thing scarier than Mark Zuckerberg running Facebook is government running Facebook. And I agree. I agree. Like, what we're not talking about nationalizing. So it's not a sort of old school debate about ownership.
Yeah.
It's more about reclassifying these things as a new kind of entity and then treating it differently. So it's almost like an enhanced regulatory regime where you say, it's absolutely damn obvious that, as Elon Musk is showing us day by day, you cannot have a situation where the public square, Twitter, is owned by a single person who can do things to it at will and decide who's allowed access to it and govern things like freedom of speech. It's profoundly obvious that that's a kind of category error, right? That's not the kind of thing it is. So it's not, although it's sort of about ownership, I think it's more about classification models. What kind of things are these entities, and what responsibilities and governance should attach to them that reflects the fact they're more important than just being private companies, right? This isn't just a supermarket. It's even more important than that in terms of its impact on our lives.
Yeah, it's not just nationalizing or whatever. It's like it's just fundamentally a new type of, if you like, property right, but maybe we might not even think about it like that. But like our relationship to our data and how we kind of manage that. What's your view on consumer co-ops and the use of that model for social media companies? I think especially.
I do think it's interesting as a kind of a more creative way of thinking about the challenge, because I'm often a bit nervous about the concept of ownership in the context of data. I think I've heard Jenny Tennyson talks about this very well, and she says that data is a relationship, really. That data is a relational, captures relationships between things often, and it's how can you own a relationship? So I get nervous when we default to the sort of I own my data, you own your data. Um, Someone made the point recently on a panel I was on. If I own my genetic data has a lot in common with my family's genetic data. So does that mean I own their genetic data? And if I give my genetic data away, I'm giving away their genetic data. Have they given me the right? So I think these kind of more creative ways of thinking about collective ownership, and the word I use quite often is stewardship of the closest example I think in sort of public policy history is in when we think about national parks and how we steward public land. So entities like the National Trust, for example, which sort of stewards public places, semi-public places on behalf of society and looks after them for us, but they're open access and we can go there and there are certain ways in which we can access them. You think about right to roam, for example, you're allowed to walk across certain land as
Right.
long as you behave a certain way. And it seems to me you should have a sort of digital right to roam, that you should be able to move across digital space in certain ways and not be sort of restricted in terms of where you can go and the data you can bring with you, for example. So I prefer those kinds of concepts as opposed to a sort of ownership. Seems to me a bit of a kind of a thing we've inherited, a concept we've inherited from the industrial world when you made things and owned things and the
Mm.
things were tangible as opposed to intangible as they so often are these days.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. I think I mean, I'm a bit of a fan of consumer co-ops, but because I would like to see the users have some kind of rights, like voting rights or something on how it's run. And that I think that's one piece of the puzzle, right? I don't think that's necessarily either goes with or contradicts anything that you've said about how we treat the right to roam digitally or anything like that. But I just think that, as you said, with having one person suddenly come in and able to make these decisions unilaterally, and I laugh when I say decisions because they're such bad decisions. I think that can be maybe ameliorated a bit if you give the people who are tweeting some degree of control or some right of a veto or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think this is where it blurs into the debate about democracy and the sort of public realm. And, I think it's pretty clear we need new mechanisms,
Hmm.
that deliberative mechanisms, ways to talk together about these issues, participative, as you say, ways to participate in the rulemaking. So, how do we moderate? What are the rules around behavior that we set on a platform like Facebook? It feels pretty clear that you want some participation of the users of that platform, i.e., like, citizens, in those rules so they have some legitimacy. And those rules aren't just made up by the platform. Um, and ultimately, that starts to fuse with almost the question of what is democracy in a digital age, because so much of our lives takes place in these spaces. How do we govern those spaces? How do we get together to talk about these kind of big issues like safety, like our kids? How do kids move around safely in these environments, and what rules do we want to put around that? You need like spaces within which we can discuss that and agree that. And I think I agree that the people who own those rules, if you like, and develop them have to be the users in some sense.
I mean, this leads me to another issue that you talk about, which is like how we approach regulation. Because the book, to for people who haven't read it, it's like I think it's nine sort of fresh approaches to modern problems, right? So I'd say in every chapter or almost every chapter, you're trying to bring a perspective that is not always considered. And that's true with the regulation as well. So I think this relates quite a lot to online spaces because for a lot of the 20th century, we've had this kind of infamous box ticking approach to regulation, right? And it's been very bureaucratic and kind of slow and quite easy to game. You get companies you give an example, right, of companies when they follow the letter of the regulation, but they don't follow the spirit of it. And so you kind of call for a more outcomes based, rules based approach to regulation.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think, as you say, that the sort of structure of the book is this. It's informed by this insight that throughout history, when big new problems have emerged of these kinds, um, often the solution has seemed at first radical and sort of unaffordable, even sort of dangerous. And one thing that I got very interested in is we thought this way about many of the things we now take for granted. So when you read about public sewage systems emerging in response to urbanization in the 19th century, people called this idea of building sewage systems a dangerous act of government overreach because it had never been done before, and this felt like kind of what's the state doing meddling in our sewage. And of course, now we take it, of course, we should have public sewage systems, and it largely solved the problem of sewage running in the streets. So this is a sort of conceit at the heart of the book is there will be ideas out there today that currently seem radical and unaffordable and dangerous, and that will be tomorrow's common sense. And as you say, in this case, I think this one's really starting to kind of come into being. I think that the idea is, as you say, a more outcome-based approach to regulation, and the challenge it responds to is the fact that regulators are just how do you keep up with the sheer pace of change in these
Mm.
markets? Because in the past, reductively speaking, the model was basically, a new problem emerges. We do a big investigation into that problem, often takes a year or two. The regulator thinks about whether to introduce some new laws, end up in new regulations. They consult. I mean, it takes years end to end sometimes. And in the meantime, consumers are being ripped off.
Mm.
Um, all kinds of examples of this over time on energy bills, on insurance, etc. And meanwhile, you've got companies, often big tech platforms, iterating daily. I mean, they're running A/B tests, tweaking their checkout experience, and of course they dodge these rules and find loopholes. So the outcome-based regulation idea is to say, let's stop doing this through a sort of checklist. Here are the 100 things you're not allowed to do, and let's start saying, the principle the FCA works with, for example, the Financial Conduct Authority in Britain, is treat customers fairly. And the reason it has teeth is that the FCA says if you don't treat customers fairly, if we decide that on a reasonable judgment of that term, you've treated people unfairly, we will crack down on you and you will be fined. And so it forces companies to internalize the risk judgments and to have a boardroom conversation about, do
Mm.
we feel really confident we're the right side of the line on this thing? Does the way that we're tweaking the checkout experience feel fair or not? And that's the idea, is that you don't have to continually write new rules. I mean, it would be interesting to see how it plays out. It's not entirely straightforward how you operationalize it, but it feels pretty clear you can't respond with prescriptive rules to
Mm.
these very rapid pace of change these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's been that way for quite a long time, hasn't it? I think the digital age has accelerated it. But even, I mean, I have friends who work in finance, right? And it's been like, even by the time a regulations come out, they've sort of worked around it. I mean, I guess the charge would be that your approach to regulation is potentially too vague, and open to interpretation, which might lead to more problems.
Yeah, I think that is the concern, and the jury's a bit out on this. I think the FCA has only really recently put in place this consumer duty, they call it, this idea of you must treat people fairly. I think that one example that gives me hope is if you think of other aspects of the law, like employment law, some of the terminology around how you have to treat people in the workplace is arguably is open to interpretation. And the way it works is that you have employment tribunals that over time establish through precedent and case law the
Right.
meaning of these terms. And so they stress, they test, what does it mean to be fair to an employee? What does it mean to discriminate? What does indirect discrimination mean? Are these examples of it or not? And so you get a more kind of living process in which you test and refine and kind of clarify the meaning of these terms. And over time, that's the idea, is that sort of really fleshes out what does it mean to be fair and where's the boundary. It's not straightforward, but I do think, I mean, it's sort of inevitable. You just cannot have an approach where we've tried in the past with the FCA. Again, a good example in the past is
Mm.
insurance, where the FCA said, stop conning people into accidentally auto renewing their home insurance. Make sure you send people letters telling them that their home insurance is coming to an end. And insurance companies started sending out letters with tiny font where the
Oh yeah.
warning was on page 6.
Yeah.
And so then the FCA said, you have to write it on the first page and the font has to be this size. And
Yeah.
it's a ludicrous cat and mouse game. So I
Mm.
think it's inevitable you have to move away from prescription, and we'll have to find our way really, and work out how do we make a success of this outcomes based approach.
I mean, yeah. So this, I mean, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background in this, because you do have quite an extensive background in kind of regulation and public policy. And I mean, how has this impacted your view of these problems, do you think?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's a cliche. I was going to say I've been on a journey, but I mean, I have, in a sense that the kernel of the book, the idea that led to the book, came to me when I was back in the late 2000s. I was working in Number 10 in the Gordon Brown government, and that was the sort of earliest experience I had of, obviously working in Number 10. You're sort of, in a sense, at the top of the system, ostensibly, right? You're kind of in the center of power, and seeing that play out and seeing, how do the levers of power function? This was at the height of the financial crisis, so it was quite a kind of interesting time to be there. And that was late 2000s were the earliest time when some of these effects of digital technologies, of Uber and so on, were starting to sort of be talked about. And the thing that was then very formative for me was I went to work at Citizens Advice, big charity in the UK that gives advice to people suffering problems with benefits, with welfare, with consumer markets. And I guess one lesson for me that is obvious, but I kind of learned very starkly in that environment was there is often a massive gap between the policy intent in a place like Number 10 and how it plays out in people's lives. So that was very significant. And then I also moved sort of sideways from policy work into digital work and ended up running big digital teams. And that's when I started to appreciate really the significance of technology and how technology was at the heart of so much of what we're seeing. And really, I think this is the theme that runs through the book is, I mean, broadly, we've got a sort of a 20th century state built for an industrial economy, and it's having to cope with a digital economy. And so that gap, if you like, between the sort of policy intent of like, let's pull this lever and solve this problem, that machinery doesn't work anymore, right? It just doesn't work. This sense of here's a policy problem, let's pull a lever to solve it in this mechanical state, doesn't work. I talk about it sometimes as a governance gap, that there's this growing gap, the state is falling behind. And we need to rebuild it in some senses, I think, in order to catch up.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good way of putting it. I think so. Let me challenge you a little bit on this, because I mean what I was trying to get at is, as I mentioned earlier, you have a kind of problem solving, somewhat optimistic, let's say conditionally optimistic view of the world. And I think some people, maybe people who listen to me who are maybe a bit more on the left or maybe even on the right, I don't know, they would say, well, you've got this technocratic approach, this problem solving approach, this kind of good faith approach, but are these problems not being caused by like quite powerful actors? Are there not powerful interests who benefit from, for example, you talk about things like the gig economy and workers being exploited, burnout, really poor safety nets, and lack of regulation that we've been discussing. Is it maybe not enough just to be like, okay, I've thought of a clever solution to this problem because there's all these powerful vested interests involved?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it's not. I think that's right, and it's not so much a technocratic argument in the sense that power runs through all of these, absolutely runs through all of these problems, and it did before, right? I mean, when we talked about things like pollution in rivers, sewage, and so on, when we put in place reforms like public healthcare, education, public health systems, there were stunningly powerful vested interests that had to be overcome in those cases, right? I mean, some of them private, the big industrial monopolies that we did break up in the past, big railway monopolies that we began to regulate and sometimes broke up. A lot of the vested interests in the past were also public vested interests. So, there were many fragmented local sewage commissioners, for example, who had to be persuaded to give up their power or have their power taken away when we sort of centralized certain aspects of the sewage network. So I don't know. Some of my optimism comes from we have done this before. Some of it comes from the sense of the dynamic I sometimes describe is this sort of mudslide dynamic that you get where policy change is not it's not very steady or even. It kind of the problem builds up on a hillside like the mud. And then there's a rainstorm of some kind that triggers the mudslide, and you get a lot of change suddenly very quickly. And I do think the system is not very good at changing day by day, but it's better at changing sort of decade by decade in the sense that, crises unlock change. Frankly, concern about kind of rising public fury and frustration unlocks change. Because at the end of the day, the system has some democratic instincts and has some responsiveness built into it. So although I think things might get worse before they get better, and I think sometimes things do get very bad. So that the sewage on the bank of the Thames was 2 meters deep before we built the sewers.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, the shit piles up, but when it does, we have proven time and again that we do. That there are mechanisms by which we overcome the vested interests, and cut through it. So I don't know. I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting actually because I think it can feel like you're shouting into the dark sometimes, and there's like all these powerful interests or whatever ideological barriers that prevent ideas from being implemented. But then you do get breakthroughs, right? And like for example, with Biden, we did actually see a lot of the ideas that were originally called the Green New Deal, and they weren't perfectly in the form that the New Economics Foundation in the UK originally put them in, but there were a lot of ideas shared with the Green New Deal, right? And they were in fact implemented, and that's in America, which is obviously has an extremely challenging political system, shall we say? So yeah, I mean, I think I do share your cautious optimism, or what do you call it? Short-term optimism, short-term pessimism, long-term optimism. Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you can see, you almost have this visual of, you can see ideas migrating. This migration I talked about, where ideas start off as radical fringe ideas, dismissed as like, unthinkable. And you can see ideas sort of float into the mainstream. And I think I talk about in the book about the 4-day working week as an idea. This was not in the debate of a few decades ago, and
yeah,
it came into the debate increasingly being talked about, trialed by companies, growing number of pilots around it, growing evidence around it. I also talk in the book about the original 5-day working week and the fact that the 2-day weekend is something we invented. We forget this, that Saturday and Sunday being a weekend. This is something we invented. This isn't a natural a
yeah,
natural
yeah.
phenomenon. And that was seen as wildly radical, the idea that people would have 2 days off in their working week. And we did that for similar reasons, because workers were knackered, because it turns out doing factory work 6 days a week, you don't end up being very productive because you're exhausted.
You tell
And
quite a
so
funny story about the people being drunk. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to. There's a funny story about people being too drunk to work on Mondays during the Industrial Revolution, right, in the book.
yeah, there was a great sort of deal between working people and factory bosses, I guess, because people started getting so drunk on Sundays that it became known as Saint Mondays, where people would take off the Monday to recover from the hangover. And so in the end, there was a sort of like, well, if we give people Saturdays, maybe they'll drink on Saturday, be hungover in church on Sunday, and they'll come to work on the Monday. So there's all kinds of funny sort of trade, like negotiations, implicit and otherwise, that happen at these times. But yeah, that point, we created the weekend, and now we act as if it's just a thing. And so, I would put money on a 4-day working week in 20, 30 years' time, feeling
Yeah.
like sort of quite commonsensical.
I think as well. One thing is that it's kind of happening. That's the thing with these changes. It's really interesting, isn't it? Like to observe them. And when you're, I guess, a social scientist, you sort of you end up being observing society, sort of like you're at a zoo or something in the end, don't you? But I've been noticing the 4-day working week is kind of happening. Some workplaces are implementing it explicitly, but more generally, especially in London, people have just stopped working on Fridays. Certainly Friday afternoon, right? And I think in a lot of cities, that's what you've got. People just start doing it, right? And then employers and governments end up having to move with the people, right? And so it's not that regulation, the legislation, if eventually put in, it will obviously have an effect, a major effect, but it goes with the social change rather than just coming from the top down and then everybody works 4 days a week suddenly.
And yeah, and that's exactly how these changes almost always play out in some respects. It's funny, in day-to-day politics, we always talk in terms of almost trying, can we persuade the prime minister or the government to do a thing? And this is quite sort of this empowering lack of agency, and this kind of, if only we could persuade the government. And as you
Mm.
say, if you look back at social change in history, it's almost always the other way around that social change bubbles up, people start doing something differently. 4 day, the weekend was a really good example. I think another good example is social insurance, where people started setting up insurance schemes for working people in the late 19th century, and eventually that became national
Yeah.
insurance and mandated. But that was quite late in the process, and the state's role really was to come in at the end and codify something and put it in law or make it mandatory, roll it out in that case. Um, but it gives me quite a lot of hope again, that sense that we're not waiting for government to do something in most of these cases. These are social changes that run way beyond the power of any government to control. Um, and so that we've got more agency than we think.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a way to be optimistic. I think, right, because it's like either in a way either the government does something or it doesn't, right? And you kind of, if you're pinning all your hopes on it doing X and it doesn't get through Congress or whatever, then obviously you're in trouble and you feel like your ideas have failed completely. But if you think about it as government as more of a reflection of something more broader that you contribute to, every time you, I don't know, have a conversation like this, release a book, talk to your friends at the pub about things, then that's much more empowering.
Absolutely. And one of the things I say at the end of the book is there are many different roles. Talk about this kind of ragtag army that fights for social change, and there's many roles in the army, right? And
Mm.
it's voting is one of them. It's actually quite a small one, really. I mean, if you think about the sort of collective impact we have over the course of a year as people in society, as you say, we have impact by talking with our families, by having a conversation down the pub and persuading a friend, by we have our role as like artists, comedians, bloggers, writers,
Sure.
um, many different kind of ways we participate in these big processes, way beyond sort of democratic politics.
Let's talk about the state then, because although everything we've just said is true, the state still has obviously legal powers, also economies of scale as well. I think it can implement things universally and at a scale that the population, civil society, businesses can't. So you are kind of what might be called a statist. I feel like statist is usually used pejoratively, um, but you're not really a libertarian, or you're not certainly not an anarchist. But I was wondering because when I generally agree with you. I think I'm a statist as well, but I also do appreciate some of the anarchist critiques of the state. And I don't know if you've read "Seeing Like a State" by James C. Scott, and what you think of those types of critiques and how you incorporated them into your proposals, if you did.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I was debating this actually with a friend yesterday that I think I mean, it depends what, but my main reflection on this concept of the state is um, I'm not convinced how useful this referring to the state as a proper noun, as a thing,
Mm.
and this is very embedded in sort of our mechanical worldview in the sense of the state as a machine, right, is our kind of mental model. When we say the state, we think of it in some ways, we visualize it as a machine with levers and or
Mm.
bureaucracy,
Mm.
administrative, right? And in a sense, I'm a statist, but I think when I talk about the state, I more think in terms of verbs these days than nouns, and really, this sense like what is the state? I mean, it's such a kind of dispersed set of different institutions with widely different governance mechanisms. There's many entities that make up what we might call the state. Drawing the boundaries of the state is very difficult. I'm not sure
Mm.
anyone knows how many entities make up what you might describe as the state in Britain, but it will be thousands, if not tens of thousands of different entities. Some local, some national, operating in many different ways. So these days I just don't love the kind of mechanical mental models of saying this the state.
Mm.
I prefer to think in terms of to run a society, you need various mechanisms by which you can do things together collectively, right? So you might need to decide something together. You might need to build something together. You might need to care for people together. And there are ways in which we do those things together. So some mechanisms like taxes, mechanisms like levies that we use to raise money to build some sewage systems together, etc. And I do think increasingly this is how we need to think about the state as more as governance as opposed to the government. And in that sense, I'm a statist in that it's very clear we need mechanisms to achieve things collectively, not least in the context of climate change. There's so many of the challenges of climate change, of regulating big tech. We're all completely at a loss as to how we respond to big tech individually. We're all sort of trying to detox, keep our phones out of our pockets, protect our kids by saying you can't have your phone after this time of day, etc.
Yeah.
It's hopeless on an individual level. So we need collective mechanisms. And whether or not we describe those things as the state, I'm not sure it feels that helpful. So I'm more interested in what are those collective mechanisms by which we solve problems together. What kind of new mechanisms do we need to solve today's problems? That feels like a good question to me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I guess you can think about it. If you think about it on a case by case basis, then, to go back to someone like James Scott, you can sort of ask the question of I've got the authority here, I've got maybe some kind of law or regulation that is, enforced by whether the police or other authorities. But do I have like democratic mechanisms? Is it like accountable? Do I have a feedback loop between the people doing the implementing and the people who are affected by it, and all of these things, right? And if you start to ask that on a case by case basis, then I think that you kind of implicitly address a lot of the anarchist critiques of the state. Although I will stress that I know any anarchists in my chat will insist that I have completely missed the point.
And there's also, I just finished the Dawn of Everything, the David
Oh wow.
Graeber and Wengrow book, which sort of gets into this kind of the anarchist critique, and the argument there being that we've actually had a wide diversity of ways of running societies throughout history. So there's a counter critique of the critique, but and they give examples of societies, big complex city societies in history that were run in ways other than a hierarchical administrative state, and sometimes were run in more sort of, you might describe as flat or sort of decentralized governance, more participative governance, for example. So their argument is, we've got into this mythology that there's only one way to run a complex, large-scale society, which is through, as you say, a bureaucratic, hierarchical state. And they say, actually, the historical record shows there are a diversity of ways, and that's really a bit of a myth. Yeah.
It reminds me a bit as well, this kind of the mechanical view of the state of this thing that we have in economics, where you've sort of got like markets and you've got government, right? And you have to decide whether the government intervenes into the market. And it's just fairly clear to me that markets are in fact a form of governance, which come with like various rules, and that's just a completely erroneous way of thinking about it. I mean, one of another example, I wanted to talk about a specific one, which everybody loves chatting about, is universal basic income, which you do advocate in the book, and I'll let you talk about it in a minute. But it strikes me that which situation is one with more government? Is it the one where if people don't have the money to buy the things that they need, and therefore they are restricted by like property laws, right, from doing those things? If you go into a shop and buy and try and take something without paying for it, then you're going to eventually probably be arrested. Or is it the situation where they get the money from the government and then they are not restricted in that way, right? Like, it seems like to me, I can't tell you which situation is more government or less government. It seems like it's just a way of reorganizing the rules we have over who gets what.
Yeah, and I think this is why, like a lot of these ideas, actually, universal basic income is intriguing in the sense that it's supported by people on the left and people on the right.
Mm.
So it's quite a curious one in terms of where you position it. Is it a right-wing idea or a left-wing idea, to use that terminology? Um, I mean, I used to be a profound skeptic about UBI, and I've become definitely less skeptical. I think partly the experience of just working at Citizens Advice, a lot of the problems we help people with at Citizens Advice were just the nightmare of interacting with the complex benefit system, right? And just the stigma, the worry, the great irony that what we call social security leaves people feeling less secure often because they have no idea how a change to their earnings or working hours will affect the benefit income, and have no idea whether or not their appeal against being declined for disability benefits will be successful or not. And just the sheer suffering that is caused by these supposedly sort of optimized, very technocratic systems, which we try to optimize with all these complex formula that say, we will make the system allocatively efficient by directing the money. And this is as true of Labour's tax credit system as of any other system. We will direct the money with sort of perfect efficiency to the households that need it the most. And the inevitable consequence of that is no one understands it. It is unbelievably complicated. It doesn't react well to modern forms of work, because if you're an Uber driver and your earnings fluctuate, suddenly your benefit income does or doesn't move around and makes your life less certain rather than more certain. And for all those reasons, I think the core principles, I guess, behind UBI are simplicity, universality, making it clear and understandable to people. And in a way, what it does is prioritize security and kind of clarity and predictability rather than efficiency. So it is undeniably less efficient to give everyone an amount of money than it is to direct and target the money at the people who need it the most. And you're just making a trade-off there. You're saying that actually these qualities like confidence, security, not being stigmatized, are more important than we thought they were. And some of these tests like allocative efficiency are slightly less important than we thought they were. So I don't know. I talk about it more as a direction of travel. I do think, whether or not we get to full UBI in sort of our lifetimes, I don't know. But I think this sense of moving towards a system that is simpler and clearer and more universal and less stigmatizing feels to me like an attractive direction of travel, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just this morning, somebody was telling me about a new absurdity of the UK benefits system. I think that the cutoff for child benefits is just like so sudden, and it like creates all sorts of weird incentives and obviously anxieties as well for the people affected. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd, and I think that's why right wingers kind of like it, because I think they've realised that it's more quote unquote statist to have this complex web of means tests and stuff, and actually what you end up with is the government being much more involved in people's lives, right? Whereas if you just have a UBI, then you're just like, right, okay, it's done administratively, not very costly, and people don't really have to deal with state organs directly.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk in the book. I give an example of person I spoke to who was receiving benefits and who got a knock on her door from sort of fraud inspectors asking her, is the man that has been staying at her house her new partner or not? And asking private questions about, like, do her kids consider this man to be a dad to them? And
Jesus.
it's just like stunning. And this happens all the time
Yeah.
in the name of tackling benefit fraud. And so it's a very strange situation when people on the right are advocating this kind of behavior by the state in people's lives, as people who are ostensibly liberal. Um, and so I think you can see the attractiveness. I mean, I think it's not easy. And I'm like quite careful in the book to say this is not a panacea, that there are very difficult judgment calls to make on, if you make the system less efficient, does it reduce the incomes of some people who need it the most? And so you need to think carefully about how it's funded. You think carefully about how it will be taxed away for people on higher incomes. And there's debates about how you set all those parameters. But as a sort of principle, if you like, of being simpler and getting out of this sort of I just was like quite uncomfortable, meddling, and as the right would call it, red tape, I
Yeah.
suppose. It is a necessity of a very complex benefit system. I don't know. I think that's why it's gaining some traction.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it is a really good idea. I was a skeptic as well. I think just with the evidence for UBI, like all of the trials, it's really difficult to find one that went badly with UBI. Like that, every single trial seems to show that it has positive effects on people, and the negative effects in terms of whether people can drop out of work or whether there's inflation or whatever negative effects you might expect. They just really small or non-existent.
Yeah, the work effects are I'm always very struck by, and as you say, most of the trials are quite. I think like the balance of view is quite clear on that. That this instinct that if you give people, if you like, free money, unconditional money, then people will sit at home and stop working. Um, doesn't play out in the impacts you see, and like by and large, people use the money to do what we might think of as positive things. Maybe they do a bit more training, take some time off to learn new skills. Some people spend a bit more time with their kids if they've got very young kids, and
Yeah.
similar to kind of paternity leave type mechanism, particularly in the States where that's so inadequate. So you know, and interestingly, I quote Winston Churchill in the book, who said, you essentially you want a system that runs more on hope than on fear, and that's what the sort of UBI starts to do. Is it starts to say, well, let's trust people to want to get ahead in life and do decent things, and not feel like we have to kind of keep people in perpetual fear of poverty in order to kind of convince people to move into the workplace.
I mean, since we're talking about sort of stigma and benefits, I was going to ask you about something I saw you tweet about. I hope you don't mind me asking, but you tweeted about it publicly. But I think you had a sort of uh, an injury recently, right? Or like a temporary disability, you kind of called it. And I was really interested to ask you about this because I remember you. I'm not sure if you were on crutches or something, or right. That's right. Um, and you said you really immediately noticed the stigma of how people treated you. And are you all better now? By the way, or is that
No, I mean,
or
I
not?
no, and it's I feel quite sort of it's been I feel almost a bit ashamed about this because I thought I understood disability discrimination, and I've worked for a long time in public policy and worked alongside many fantastic campaigners for disability rights and so on. And it was about what was it about 15 to 18 months ago, I was running for the train. So read the signs that say don't run for the train. And I slipped on the platform and smashed my hip, and it hasn't got better. And it's become a chronic condition. So I basically can't walk and or any real distance. Um, and it's just stunning. I mean, I think like it's been so eye-opening in a way it shouldn't have been because I should have known this. But people, I don't know, shouting at me in the street, shouting anti-disability slurs at me in the street for walking slowly, and people leaning out of their cars to shout, to scream swear words. Um, but just the inaccessibility of places, like the number of doors you have to get through, the fact that the lift door closes too quickly for me to get to it because I
Mm.
can't get to it quickly enough on crutches. Um, the number of spaces, the inaccessibility of public transport. It's really, I mean, it's just one of those things where it shouldn't take an injury to yourself to feel to appreciate these things, but it hasn't. Just like kind of experiencing them directly, I feel quite even more strongly this sense of just how inaccessible and how much discrimination there still is against disabled people. Um, so I don't know how we combat that because as I say, it shouldn't take an injury, and we shouldn't all have to have an injury before we realize that. I should have realized it before, but wow, I
Well,
really
yeah.
realized it.
I mean, I wouldn't beat yourself up about it. I don't think that anybody can um, truly understand something like that unless they've experienced it firsthand. But I think obviously the best thing we can do is listen, right, to people who have experienced it.
And it's just the fundamental insight that we build the world for able-bodied people.
Yeah.
And so everything, crossing the street, the timing for the green light, crossing a street, I can't get across in time. And so the cars start going and then scream at me because I'm still in
Yeah.
the road. And that must be true of anyone who's got mobility issues or who's very elderly and walks slowly. So why are we doing that? And it's no worse for people if we make the time a little bit better. Most of these things, if there are ramps instead of steps, as people say with accessibility work, generally if you design for the edge case, as people put it, it makes the service better for everyone.
Hmm.
So it's we've got a long way to go, I think, on inclusive design in public services.
Yeah, yeah, it's absolutely everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. I just wanted to ask you because I literally just saw you tweet about it, and it seemed like the the inaccessibility and also just the abuse. Like it really. Maybe I just am a bit sheltered, but I mean that shocks me. That you
Shocks
just
me the
get
level of anger.
yeah.
Yeah. And it's people seem. I mean, I say people. I mean, it's a small portion of people, but it's not. It happens often to me, and people seem furious that you dare to deviate from what might be considered the norm of behavior by maybe walking more slowly, or it's a really curious. It's really curious. I have to say, often it is people in cars, and there's something very strange that happens to people. I think normal people, if you like, in cars when they turn into absolute psychopaths
Well,
and start
ban
screaming at people.
cars. I mean, ban cars. Like there you go. that's that's
I
the
often think
conclusion.
I often think that these cars are a bit like tweets in the sense that people seem to behave just completely differently when they're on Twitter and when they're in cars. There's
Yeah,
this thing about like people talk about it as the affordances, like the kind of like the way the medium is the message is the phrase, right? It's like it
yeah.
changes the way we communicate. But, there's something strange, similar about the car and the tweet.
Maybe we should just get rid of both.
Maybe that's what we do. Beyond cars and beyond Twitter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so
People tweeting from cars is probably the worst of all
yeah,
worlds.
tweeting while driving. Yeah, I think
Tweeting while
that's.
driving is the
I
worst,
dread to
the
think what
angriest of
people
all
would come out
people.
with. Yeah. Well, James, look, this was supposed to be until 12, and we're over the hour now, so I don't want to keep you anymore. But it's been really interesting. Thanks so much, and I recommend. I stress, I'm not on commission. Don't know how to work my camera. Yeah, End State is the name of the book, and it's really really good. It's a really refreshing take on many of the modern problems, and an optimistic one because there is no need for outright pessimism. So thanks
It's
again for coming,
optimistic.
James.
It's optimistic. Thanks so
Yeah.
much for having me.
Okay, see you. Okay, everybody. That is done. Hobby for the podcast version. This is your sign to cut it. But anyway, I shouldn't be showing you all my emails. I mean, it was literally just the invite to James. But thanks, everybody. Yeah, I need better moderation. I thought I had Nightbot, but it just wasn't working. But I think Nightbot only works on YouTube if people are spamming. But anyway, I'll see you all soon for a gaming stream or whatever. Bye.